Chapter 27 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. The sun of Martin's good fortune rose. The day after Ruth's visit, he received a check for $3 from a New York scandal weekly in payment for 3 of his triolets. 2 days later, a newspaper published in Chicago accepted his treasure hunters, promising to pay $10 for it on publication. The price was small, but it was the first article he had written, his very first attempt to express his thought on the printed page. To cap everything, the adventure serial for boys, his second attempt, was accepted before the end of the week by a juvenile monthly calling itself Youth and Age. It was true the serial was 21,000 words, and they offered to pay him $16 on publication, which was something like 75 cents a thousand words. But it was equally true that it was the second thing he had attempted to write, and that he was himself thoroughly aware of its clumsy worthlessness. But even his earliest efforts were not marked with the clumsiness of mediocrity. What characterized them was the clumsiness of too great strength, the clumsiness which the tyro betrays when he crushes butterflies with battering rams and hammers out vignettes with a war club. So it was that Martin was glad to sell his early efforts for songs. He knew them for what they were, and it had not taken him long to acquire this knowledge. What he pinned his faith to was his later work. He had striven to be something more than a mere writer of magazine fiction. He had sought to equip himself with the tools of artistry. On the other hand, he had not sacrificed strength. His conscious aim had been to increase his strength by avoiding excess of strength. Nor had he departed from his love of reality. His work was realism, though he had endeavored to fuse with it the fancies and beauties of imagination. What he sought was an impassioned realism, shot through with human aspiration and faith. What he wanted was life as it was, with all its spirit groping and soul-reaching left in. He had discovered, in the course of his reading, 2 schools of fiction. One treated of man as a god, ignoring his earthly origin. The other treated of man as a clod, ignoring his heaven-sent dreams and divine possibilities. Both the god and the clod schools erred, in Martin's estimation, and erred through too great singleness of sight and purpose. There was a compromise that approximated the truth, though it flattered not the school of God, while it challenged the brute savageness of the school of clod. It was his story, Adventure, which had dragged him with Ruth, that Martin believed had achieved his ideal of the true in fiction, and it was in an essay, God and Clod, that he had expressed his views on the whole general subject. But Adventure, and all that he deemed his best work, still went begging among the editors. His early work counted for nothing in his eyes except for the money it brought, and his horror stories, 2 of which had sold, he did not consider high work nor his best work. To him they were frankly imaginative and fantastic, though invested with all the glamour of the real, wherein lay their power. This investiture of the grotesque and impossible with reality he looked upon as a trick, a skillful trick at best. Great literature could not reside in such a field. Their artistry was high, but he denied the worthwhileness of artistry when divorced from humanness. The trick had been to fling over the face of his artistry a mask of humanness. And this he had done in the half-dozen or so stories of the horror brand he had written before he emerged upon the high peaks of adventure, joy, the pot, and the wine of life. The $3 he received for the triolets he used to eke out a precarious existence against the arrival of the white mouse check. He cashed the first check with the suspicious Portuguese grocer, paying $1 on account and dividing the remaining $2 between the baker and the fruit store. Martin was not rich enough to afford meat, and he was on slim allowance when the white mouse check arrived. He was divided on the cashing of it. He had never been in a bank in his life, much less been in one on business. And he had a naive and childlike desire to walk into one of the big banks down in Oakland and fling down his endorsed check for $40. On the other hand, practical common sense ruled that he should cash it with his grocer and thereby make an impression that would later result in an increase of credit. Reluctantly, Martin yielded to the claims of the grocer, paying his bill with him in full, and receiving in change a pocketful of jingling coin. Also, he paid the other tradesmen in full, redeemed his suit and his bicycle, paid 1 month's rent on the typewriter, and paid Maria the overdue month for his room, and a month in advance. This left him in his pocket, for emergencies, a balance of nearly $3. In itself, this small sum seemed a fortune. Immediately on recovering his clothes, he had gone to see Ruth, and on the way he could not refrain from jingling the little handful of silver in his pocket. He had been so long without money that, like a rescued starving man who could not let unconsumed food out of his sight, Martin had not kept his hand off the silver. He was not mean nor avaricious, but the money meant more than so many dollars and cents. It stood for success, and the eagles stamped upon the coins were to him so many winged victories. It came to him insensibly that it was a very good world. It certainly appeared more beautiful to him. For weeks it had been a very dull and somber world, but now, with nearly all debts paid, $3 jingling in his pocket, and in his mind the consciousness of success, the sun shone bright and warm, and even a rain squall that soaked unprepared pedestrians seemed a merry happening to him. When he starved, his thoughts had dwelled upon the thousands he knew were starving the world over. But now that he was feasted full, the fact of the thousands starving was no longer pregnant in his brain. He forgot about them, and, being in love, remembered the countless lovers of the world. Without deliberately thinking about it, motifs for love lyrics began to agitate his brain. Swept away by the creative impulse, he got off the electric car, without vexation, 2 blocks beyond his crossing. He found a number of persons in the Morse home. Ruth's 2 girl cousins were visiting her from San Rafael, and Mrs. Morse, under pretext of entertaining them, was pursuing her plan of surrounding Ruth with young people. The campaign had begun during Martin's enforced absence, and was already in full swing. She was making a point of having at the house men who were doing things. Thus, in addition to the cousins Dorothy and Florence, Martin encountered 2 university professors, one of Latin, the other of English, a young army officer just back from the Philippines, one-time schoolmate of Ruth's, a young fellow named Melville, private secretary to Joseph Perkins, head of the San Francisco Trust Company, and finally of the men, a live bank cashier, Charles Hapgood, a youngish man of 35, graduate of Stanford University, member of the Nile Club and the Unity Club, and a conservative speaker for the Republican Party during campaigns. In short, a rising young man in every way. Among the women was one who painted portraits, another who was a professional musician, and still another who possessed the degree of Doctor of Sociology, and who was locally famous for her social settlement work in the slums of San Francisco. But the women did not count much in Mrs. Morse's plan. At the best, they were necessary accessories. The men who did things must be drawn to the house somehow. "Don't get excited when you talk," Ruth admonished Martin, before the ordeal of introduction began. He bore himself a bit stiffly at first, oppressed by a sense of his own awkwardness, especially of his shoulders, which were up to their old trick of threatening destruction to furniture and ornaments. Also, he was rendered self-conscious by the company. He had never before been in contact with such exalted beings, nor with so many of them. Melville, the bank cashier, fascinated him, and he resolved to investigate him at the first opportunity. For underneath Martin's awe lurked his assertive ego, and he felt the urge to measure himself with these men and women, and to find out what they had learned from the books and life which he had not learned. Ruth's eyes roved to him frequently to see how he was getting on, and she was surprised and gladdened by the ease with which he got acquainted with her cousins. He certainly did not grow excited, while being seated removed from him the worry of his shoulders. Ruth knew them for clever girls, superficially brilliant, and she could scarcely understand their praise of Martin later that night at going to bed. But he, on the other hand, a wit of his own class, a gay quizzer and laughter-maker at dances and Sunday picnics, had found the making of fun and the breaking of good-natured lances simple enough in this environment. And on this evening success stood at his back, patting him on the shoulder and telling him he was making good so that he could afford to laugh and make laughter and remain unabashed. Later, Ruth's anxiety found justification. Martin and Professor Caldwell had got together in a conspicuous corner, and though Martin no longer wove the air with his hands, to Ruth's critical eye he permitted his own eyes to flash and glitter too frequently, talked too rapidly and warmly, grew too intense, and allowed his aroused blood to redden his cheeks too much. He lacked decorum and control, and was in decided contrast to the young professor of English with whom he talked. But Martin was not concerned with appearances. He had been swift to note the other's trained mind and to appreciate his command of knowledge. Furthermore, Professor Caldwell did not realize Martin's concept of the average English professor. Martin wanted him to talk shop, and, though he seemed averse at first, succeeded in making him do it. For Martin did not see why a man should not talk shop. "It's absurd and unfair," he had told Ruth weeks before, this objection to talking shop. For what reason under the sun do men and women come together, if not for the exchange of the best that is in them? And the best that is in them is what they are interested in, the thing by which they make their living, the thing they've specialized on and sat up days and nights over, and even dreamed about. Imagine Mr. Butler living up to social etiquette and enunciating his views on Paul Verlaine, or the German drama, or the novels of D'Annunzio. We'd be bored to death. I, for one, if I must listen to Mr. Butler, prefer to hear him talk about his law. It's the best that is in him, and life is so short that I want the best of every man and woman I meet. But, Ruth had objected, there are the topics of general interest to all. There you mistake, he had rushed on. All persons in society, all cliques in society, or rather, nearly all persons and cliques, ape their betters. Now, who are the best betters? The idlers, the wealthy idlers. They do not know, as a rule, the things known by the persons who are doing something in the world. To listen to conversation about such things would mean to be bored. Wherefore the idlers decree that such things are shop and must not be talked about. Likewise, they decree the things that are not shop and which may be talked about, and those things are the latest operas, latest novels, cards, billiards, cocktails, automobiles, horse shows, trout fishing, tuna fishing, big game shooting, yacht sailing, and so forth. And, mark you, these are the things the idlers know. In all truth, they constitute the shop talk of the idlers. And the funniest part of it is that many of the clever people, and all the would-be clever people, allow the idlers so to impose upon them. As for me, I want the best a man's got in him. Call it shop vulgarity or anything you please. And Ruth had not understood. This attack of his on the established had seemed to her just so much willfulness of opinion. So Martin contaminated Professor Caldwell with his own earnestness, challenging him to speak his mind. As Ruth paused beside them, she heard Martin saying, "You surely don't pronounce such heresies in the University of California." Professor Caldwell shrugged his shoulders. "The honest taxpayer and the politician, you know. Sacramento gives us our appropriations, and therefore we kowtow to Sacramento, and to the Board of Regents, and to the party press, or to the press of both parties." "Yes, that's clear, but how about you?" Martin urged. "You must be a fish out of the water." "Few like me, I imagine, in the university pond. Sometimes I am fairly sure that I am out of water, and that I should belong in Paris, in Grub Street, in a hermit's cave, or in some sadly wild bohemian crowd, drinking claret, Dago Red, they call it in San Francisco, dining in cheap restaurants in the Latin Quarter, and expressing vociferously radical views upon all creation. Really, I am frequently almost sure that I was cut out to be a radical. But then, there are so many questions on which I am not sure. I grow timid when I am face to face with my human frailty, which ever prevents me from grasping all the factors in any problem, human, vital problems, you know. And as he talked on, Martin became aware that to his own lips had come the song of the trade wind. I am strongest at noon, but under the moon I stiffen the bunt of the sail. He was almost humming the words, and it dawned upon him that the other reminded him of the trade wind, of the northeast trade, steady and cool and strong. He was equable. He was to be relied upon, and withal there was a certain bafflement about him. Martin had the feeling that he never spoke his full mind, just as he had often had the feeling that the trades never blew their strongest, but always held reserves of strength that were never used. Martin's trick of visioning was active as ever. His brain was a most accessible storehouse of remembered fact and fancy, and its contents seemed ever ordered and spread for his inspection. Whatever occurred in the instant present, Martin's mind immediately presented associated antithesis or similitude, which ordinarily expressed themselves to him in vision. It was sheerly automatic, and his visioning was an unfailing accompaniment to the living present, just as Ruth's face, in a momentary jealousy, had called before his eyes a forgotten moonlight gale, and as Professor Caldwell made him see again the northeast trade, herding the white billows across the purple sea, so, from moment to moment, not disconcerting, but rather identifying and classifying, new memory visions rose before him, or spread under his eyelids, or were thrown upon the screen of his consciousness. These visions came out of the actions and sensations of the past, out of things and events and books of yesterday and last week. A countless host of apparitions that, waking or sleeping, forever thronged his mind. So it was, as he listened to Professor Caldwell's easy flow of speech, the conversation of a clever, cultured man, that Martin kept seeing himself down all his past. He saw himself when he had been quite the hoodlum, wearing a stiff-rimmed Stetson hat and a square-cut double-breasted coat, with a certain swagger to the shoulders, and possessing the ideal of being as tough as the police permitted. He did not disguise it to himself, nor attempt to palliate it. At one time in his life he had been just a common hoodlum, the leader of a gang that worried the police and terrorized honest, working-class householders. But his ideals had changed. He glanced about him at the well-bred, well-dressed men and women, and breathed into his lungs the atmosphere of culture and refinement, and at the same moment the ghost of his early youth, in stiff rim and square cut, with swagger and toughness, stalked across the room. This figure of the corner hoodlum he saw merge into himself, sitting and talking with an actual university professor. For, after all, he had never found his permanent abiding place. He had fitted in wherever he found himself, been a favorite always and everywhere, by virtue of holding his own at work and at play, and by his willingness and ability to fight for his rights and command respect. But he had never taken root. He had fitted in sufficiently to satisfy his fellows, but not to satisfy himself. He had been perturbed always by a feeling of unrest, had heard always the call of something from beyond, and had wandered on through life, seeking it, until he found books and art and love. And here he was, in the midst of all this, the only one of all the comrades he had adventured with, who could have made themselves eligible for the inside of the Morse home. But such thoughts and visions did not prevent him from following Professor Caldwell closely, and as he followed, comprehendingly and critically. He noted the unbroken field of the other's knowledge. As for himself, from moment to moment the conversation showed him gaps and open stretches, whole subjects with which he was unfamiliar. Nevertheless, thanks to his Spencer, he saw that he possessed the outlines of the field of knowledge. It was a matter only of time when he would fill in the outline. Then, watch out, he thought. Wear shoal, everybody. He felt like sitting at the feet of the professor, worshipful and absorbent. But as he listened, he began to discern a weakness in the other's judgments, a weakness so stray and elusive that he might not have caught it had it not been ever present. And when he did catch it, he leapt to equality at once. Ruth came up to them a second time, just as Martin began to speak. "I'll tell you where you are wrong, or, rather, what weakens your judgments," he said. "You lack biology. There is no place in your scheme of things, I mean the real interpretive biology, from the ground up, from the laboratory and the test tube and the vitalized inorganic, right up to the widest aesthetic and sociological generalizations." Ruth was appalled. She had sat 2 lecture courses under Professor Caldwell and looked up to him as the living repository of all knowledge. "I scarcely follow you," he said dubiously. Martin was not so sure, but what he had followed him. "Then I'll try to explain," he said. "I remember reading in Egyptian history something to the effect that understanding could not be had of Egyptian art without first studying the land question." "Quite right," the professor nodded. "And it seems to me," Martin continued, "that knowledge of the land question, in turn, of all questions, for that matter, cannot be had without previous knowledge of the stuff and the constitution of life. How can we understand laws and institutions, religions and customs, without understanding, not merely the nature of the creatures that made them, but the nature of the stuff out of which the creatures are made? Is literature any less human than the architecture and sculpture of Egypt? Is there one thing in the known universe that is not subject to the law of evolution? Oh, I know there is an elaborate evolution of the various arts laid down, but it seems to me to be too mechanical. The human himself is left out. The evolution of the tool, of the harp, of music and song and dance are all beautifully elaborated. But how about the evolution of the human himself? The development of the basic and intrinsic parts that were in him before he made his first tool or gibbered his first chant? It is that which you do not consider, and which I call biology. It is biology in its largest aspects. I know I express myself incoherently, but I've tried to hammer out the idea. It came to me as you were talking, so I was not primed and ready to deliver it. You spoke yourself of the human frailty that prevented one from taking all the factors into consideration, and you, in turn, or so it seems to me, leave out the biological factor, the very stuff out of which has been spun the fabric of all our arts, the warp and the woof of all human actions and achievements. To Ruth's amazement, Martin was not immediately crushed, and that the professor replied in the way he did struck her as forbearance for Martin's youth. Professor Caldwell sat for a full minute, silent and fingering his watch chain. "Do you know," he said at last, "I've had that same criticism passed on me once before, by a very great man, a scientist and evolutionist, Joseph LeConte. But he is dead, and I thought to remain undetected. And now you come along and expose me. Seriously, though, and this is confession, I think there is something in your contention, a great deal, in fact. I am too classical, not enough up to date in the interpretive branches of science, and I can only plead the disadvantages of my education and a temperamental slothfulness that prevents me from doing the work. I wonder if you'll believe that I've never been inside a physics or chemistry laboratory. It is true, nevertheless. LeConte was right, and so are you, Mr. Eden, at least to an extent. How much, I do not know." Ruth drew Martin away with her on a pretext. When she had got him aside, whispering, "You shouldn't have monopolized Professor Caldwell that way. There may be others who want to talk with him." "My mistake. Martin admitted contritely. "But I'd got him stirred up, and he was so interesting that I did not think. Do you know, he is the brightest, the most intellectual man I have ever talked with. And I'll tell you something else. I once thought that everybody who went to universities, or who sat in the high places in society, was just as brilliant and intelligent as he." "He's an exception," she answered. "I should say so. Whom do you want me to talk to now? Oh, say, bring me up against that cashier fellow." Martin talked for 15 minutes with him, nor could Ruth have wished better behavior on her lover's part. Not once did his eyes flash, nor his cheeks flush, while the calmness and poise with which he talked surprised her. But in Martin's estimation the whole tribe of bank cashiers fell a few 100%, and for the rest of the evening he labored under the impression that bank cashiers and talkers of platitudes were synonymous phrases. The army officer he found good-natured and simple, a healthy, wholesome young fellow, content to occupy the place in life into which birth and luck had flung him. On learning that he had completed 2 years in the university, Martin was puzzled to know where he had stored it away. Nevertheless, Martin liked him better than the platitudinous bank cashier. "I really don't object to platitudes," he told Ruth later, "but what worries me into nervousness is the pompous, smugly complacent, superior certitude with which they are uttered, and the time taken to do it. Why, I could give that man the whole history of the Reformation in the time he took to tell me that the Union Labor Party had fused with the Democrats. Do you know, he skins his words as a professional poker player skins the cards that are dealt out to him. Some day I'll show you what I mean." "I'm sorry you don't like him," was her reply. "He's a favorite of Mr. Butler's. Mr. Butler says he is safe and honest, calls him the Rock, Peter, and says that upon him any banking institution can well be built." "I don't doubt it, from the little I saw of him and the less I heard from him, but I don't think so much of banks as I did. You don't mind my speaking my mind this way, dear?" "No, no, it is most interesting." "Yes," Martin went on heartily. "I'm no more than a barbarian getting my first impressions of civilization. Such impressions must be entertainingly novel to the civilized person." "What did you think of my cousins?" Ruth queried. "I liked them better than the other women. There's plenty of fun in them along with the paucity of pretense." "Then you did like the other women?" He shook his head. "That social settlement woman is no more than a sociological poll parrot. I swear, if you winnowed her out between the stars, like Tomlinson, there would be found in her not one original thought. As for the portrait painter, she was a positive bore. She'd make a good wife for the cashier. And the musician woman, I don't care how nimble her fingers are, how perfect her technique, how wonderful her expression. The fact is, she knows nothing about music." "She plays beautifully," Ruth protested. "Yes, she's undoubtedly gymnastic in the externals of music, but the intrinsic spirit of music is unguessed by her. I asked her what music meant to her. You know I'm always curious to know that particular thing. And she did not know what it meant to her, except that she adored it, and that it was the greatest of the arts, and that it meant more than life to her." "You were making them talk shop," Ruth charged him. "I confess it. And if they were failures on shop, imagine my sufferings if they had discoursed on other subjects. Why, I used to think that up here, where all the advantages of culture were enjoyed—" He paused for a moment and watched the youthful shade of himself, in stiff rim and square cut, enter the door and swagger across the room. "As I was saying, up here I thought all men and women were brilliant and radiant. But now, from what little I've seen of them, they strike me as a pack of ninnies, most of them, and 90% of the remainder as bores. Now, there's Professor Caldwell. He's different. He's a man, every inch of him, and every atom of his gray matter." Ruth's face brightened. "Tell me about him," she urged. "Not what is large and brilliant. I know those qualities. But whatever you feel is adverse. I am most curious to know." "Perhaps I'll get myself in a pickle." Martin debated humorously for a moment. "Suppose you tell me first. Or maybe you find in him nothing less than the best. I attended 2 lecture courses under him, and I have known him for 2 years. That is why I am anxious for your first impression." "Bad impression, you mean. Well, here goes. He is all the fine things you think about him, I guess. At least he is the finest specimen of intellectual man I have met. But he is a man with a secret shame." "Oh, no, no," he hastened to cry. "Nothing paltry nor vulgar. What I mean is that he strikes me as a man who has gone to the bottom of things, and is so afraid of what he saw that he makes believe to himself that he never saw it. Maybe that's not the clearest way to express it. Here's another way. A man who has found the path to the hidden temple but has not followed it, who has, perhaps, caught glimpses of the temple and striven afterward to convince himself that it was only a mirage of foliage. Yet another way. A man who could have done things, but who placed no value on the doing, and who, all the time, in his innermost heart, is regretting that he has not done them, who has secretly laughed at the rewards for doing, and yet, still more secretly, has yearned for the rewards and for the joy of doing." "I don't read him that way," she said. "And for that matter, I don't see just what you mean." "It is only a vague feeling on my part," Martin temporized. "I have no reason for it. It is only a feeling, and most likely it is wrong. You certainly should know him better than I." From the evening at Ruth's, Martin brought away with him strange confusions and conflicting feelings. He was disappointed in his goal, in the persons he had climbed to be with. On the other hand, he was encouraged with his success. The climb had been easier than he expected. He was superior to the climb, and he did not, with false modesty, hide it from himself. He was superior to the beings among whom he had climbed, with the exception, of course, of Professor Caldwell. About life and the books he knew more than they, and he wondered into what nooks and crannies they had cast aside their educations. He did not know that he was himself possessed of unusual brain vigor, nor did he know that the persons who were given to probing the depths and to thinking ultimate thoughts were not to be found in the drawing-rooms of the world's Morses. Nor did he dream that such persons were as lonely eagles, sailing solitary in the azure sky, far above the earth and its swarming freight of gregarious life. End of chapter 27.